3 minutes after I stepped onto the property, sirens blared and she screamed for the police, accusing me of trespassing. But 30 minutes before that, I did something she never expected. 3 minutes was all she needed to assert her power, to point her finger, to flaunt her control. But those 30 minutes, I quietly changed the game. Her arrogant confidence didn't have time to register that things had changed, and when the police car pulled up, she still thought she was winning until the truth hit her like a slap in the face. I didn't need to raise my voice, I just stood still and let her crumble before the eyes of the entire neighborhood. After nearly 2 decades as a civil engineer for the city, I've settled into a more peaceful existence. I live alone in our small house in Meadowbrook Gardens, which my late wife Linda and I called home before she died of cancer last year. My daily routine is simple: white button-down shirt, brown khakis, just the casual attire of a middle-aged working man. My name is David Mitchell, 42, and while I try to live a quiet life, the dynamics of my neighborhood are about to be disrupted. Karen Matthews, the 44-year-old HOA president, has been in office for 3 years. With her short, neatly cropped blonde hair and signature purple jacket, Karen has turned the HOA into her own personal kingdom, with herself sitting firmly at the top like a self-proclaimed queen. The trouble started with something so innocent: a single rose bush. After Linda's funeral, I needed something to honor her memory, something beautiful in our little garden. She had always loved roses, especially the deep pink ones that reminded her of her grandmother's garden back in Ohio. So, I planted one small bush, maybe 3 feet tall, with blooms the exact shade of pink that used to make Linda smile when she sat by our kitchen window watching the sunrise. It was my quiet way of keeping her close, of having something alive and growing where everything else felt dead. Every morning, I'd water that bush and tell Linda about my day, about the neighbors, about how much I missed her laugh echoing through our empty house. That rose bush was the only thing that made me feel connected to anything good anymore. But Karen Matthews had other ideas about my memorial. 3 days after I planted Linda's rose, I found a yellow violation notice stuck to my front door, like some kind of legal scarlet letter. The bright yellow paper seemed to glow against my white door, visible to every neighbor walking by. Landscaping code violation. Fine, $200, it read in bold letters. The notice claimed my rose bush exceeded the 3-foot height limit and violated the approved color palette of light pink only. I read it twice, then 3 times, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake. This woman was literally measuring my grief, putting a price tag on my wife's memory. The fine was due within 14 days, where additional penalties would be assessed. I decided to handle this reasonably, like adults do. I walked over to Karen's house, the largest one in our community naturally, and knocked on her mahogany front door. The door itself probably cost more than most people's cars, with brass fixtures that gleamed like they were polished daily. She answered wearing that signature purple blazer, even though it was a Saturday morning, like she was perpetually ready for a board meeting or a court appeal. Her living room looked like a corporate office designed by someone who'd never heard of comfort. Everything was sharp angles and cold surfaces, a glass coffee table that reflected the light like ice, leather chairs that looked more like interrogation furniture, and a walnut desk positioned to face anyone who entered. Behind the desk hung her framed HOA president's certificate, mounted like a diploma from dictatorship school. "Mr. Mitchell," she said without offering me a seat, her voice carrying the kind of authority that expects immediate compliance. "I assume your fear about your violation notice." She gestured to one of the uncomfortable chairs but remained standing herself, maintaining the psychological advantage of looking down at me. The power dynamic was clearly intentional. This was her courtroom, and I was the defendant. "Karen, this rose bush is a memorial for my wife. She passed away just 6 months ago from cancer. Surely we can work something out here." I kept my voice calm, respectful, hoping to appeal to whatever humanity might exist beneath that purple blazer. "It's just a small bush, and it means everything to me." Karen's expression didn't change one bit, like I was discussing the weather instead of my dead wife. She picked up a ruler from her desk and held it like a weapon, or maybe a sector of authority. "Rules are rules, Mr. Mitchell. The HOA guidelines clearly state 3 feet maximum height and light pink coloration. Only personal emotions cannot override community standards." She consulted a thick binder labeled OA, Regulations Revised 3rd Edition, and flipped to a page marked with several yellow sticky notes. Your bush measures 3.2 feet, according to my measurements, and the color is clearly too dark, according to our approved palette chart. She showed me a laminated color wheel with exactly 4 shades of pink, approved for residential landscaping. These standards exist to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics. Without consistent enforcement, our community would descend into chaos. It's just 2 in, Karen, and the color difference is barely noticeable unless you're standing right next to it with a magnifying glass. I was trying to stay reasonable, but frustration was creeping into my voice. Surely there's some flexibility for special circumstances. Karen's smile was colder than a January morning, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. If we make exceptions for everyone's sob story, Mr. Mitchell, our community standards would collapse entirely. Today it's 2 in and a slightly wrong color. Tomorrow people will be planting palm trees and painting their houses neon green. The way she said sob story while talking about my dead wife, that's when I knew this wasn't about rules anymore. This was about power control, and Karen Matthews was absolutely drunk on both. She continued, consulting her binder like it was some kind of holy scripture. You have 14 days to replace your non-compliant vegetation with approved alternatives or face escalating penalties, including potential legal action. I can provide you with a list of pre-approved nurseries that carry regulation-compliant plants. The clinical way she reduced Linda's memorial to non-compliant vegetation made my hands clench into fists. This is insane, Karen. It's a memorial for my wife, not some kind of neighborhood threat. But she was already walking toward her front door, clearly dismissing me. Mr. Mitchell, the HOA board voted unanimously to strengthen enforcement of our community standards. Emotional appeals will not change the rules that everyone else managed to follow without difficulty. As I walked back to my house, I could feel Karen watching me from her window. The yellow violation notice on my door seemed to glow brighter, like a beacon advertising my non-compliance to every neighbor who passed by. That night, I sat in my garden next to Linda's rose bush, telling her about my day and wondering how someone could be so heartless about a simple memorial. The second attack came exactly 1 week later, and it was even more vicious and calculated than the first. I was getting ready for work, pouring my morning coffee and checking the weather, when my neighbor, elderly Mr. Rodriguez, knocked urgently on my door. His weathered face was creased with concern, and he was holding another yellow notice like it might bite him. David, son, I think there's been some terrible mistake. This notice says your rose bush is dead and smelling up the whole neighborhood. I took the paper from his weathered hands, nearly dropping my coffee mug in shock. Notice of public health violation. Deceased plant material creating otter nuisance. Fine. $300, it read in even larger red letters than the first notice. This is impossible, I muttered, reading the detailed description of alleged violations. The notice claimed that multiple neighbors had complained about a putrid odor emanating from decomposing plant matter, and that the deceased rose bush poses a potential health hazard to the community. It demanded immediate removal of the hazardous material within 48 hours. I walked outside to check my rose bush, Mr. Rodriguez shuffling behind me with his cane. The bush was more beautiful than ever, with new blooms opening in the morning sun and healthy green leaves that practically glowed with vitality. David, that thing's healthier than I am, Mr. Rodriguez muttered, adjusting his thick glasses. Whoever wrote this notice needs to get their eyes checked. But when I looked closer at the violation notice, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Attached was a photograph of my garden supposedly showing the deceased plant material, but the image had been clearly manipulated. The vibrant rose bush I was looking at had been made to appear withered and brown in the photo, like something from a horror movie about plant zombies. More disturbing was the angle of the photograph. Mr. Rodriguez, look at this picture. Where do you think this was taken from? He studied the image carefully, squinting through his glasses. That's definitely your garden, but whoever took this was standing on that empty lot next to your house. You know, the one the HOA says they're planning to auction off to developers. That vacant lot had been sitting there for 3 years, ever since the previous owner moved to Florida and abandoned the property. The grass was overgrown, weeds sprouted through cracks in the old sidewalk, and it had become an unofficial dumping ground for lawn clippings and fallen branches. Karen always claimed the HOA was managing it temporarily until the city could arrange a proper sale. And why would Karen or anyone else be sneaking around that lot taking pictures of my garden? I asked, though the answer was becoming uncomfortably clear. And how did they manipulate this photo to make my healthy plant look dead? Mr. Rodriguez shook his head slowly, the way old people do when the world stops making sense. Son, I've lived in this neighborhood longer than anyone else, and I've never seen anything like what's been happening since that woman took over the HOA. People are afraid to plant flowers, afraid to park their cars, afraid to do anything that might catch her attention. He pointed his cane toward Karen's house, where I could see her purple blazer moving past the windows. She's got people watching each other, reporting on each other like we're living in some kind of police state. And now she's apparently got people sneaking around empty lots, taking fake pictures of your property. The whole situation was becoming more surreal by the minute, like I was trapped in some kind of neighborhood nightmare. A third escalation happened during our monthly community meeting, and Karen orchestrated it like a public execution designed to destroy my reputation completely. She had sent notices to all 47. The notice included ominous language about residents who persistently refused to comply with community standards and the need for decisive action to maintain neighborhood quality. By the time I walked into our community center that Tuesday evening, every seat was filled with neighbors I'd known for years, but they were all staring at me like I was some kind of dangerous criminal. Karen stood at the front podium like a prosecutor about to deliver a death sentence. Her purple blazer was immaculate, pressed to perfection, and she had a PowerPoint presentation already loaded on the screen behind her. The presentation title read, Maintaining Community Standards, Addressing Persistent Violations, in bold red letters that reminded me of those violations. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been questioned or challenged. We're here tonight because one resident has repeatedly refused to comply with our community standards, threatening the property values and quality of life that we all cherish. She clicked her remote and a slide appeared listing 15 alleged violations I had supposedly committed over the past month. The list was insane, like something from a dystopian novel about suburban surveillance. Parking vehicle 2 and beyond designated boundary line documented 3 separate occasions. Displaying holiday decorations past approved removal date. Christmas wreath visible until January 8th. Engaging in suspicious surveillance while walking in community areas. Failing to maintain approved lawn height. Grass measured at 4.1 inches in violation of 4 inches maximum standard. The crowd murmured as Karen continued her character assassination with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed destroying people. Unauthorized modification of mailbox appearance. Reflective numbers replaced without HOA approval. My personal favorite was creating noise disturbances during quiet hours. Documented hammering sounds at 8:45 p.m. on Tuesday. Remembered that Tuesday I had been hanging a picture of Linda in our bedroom, something that took exactly 3 hammer taps. Apparently, Karen had been monitoring my house with the dedication of a professional stalker. And most seriously, Karen continued, advancing to a new slide, Mr. Mitchell's defiance sets a dangerous precedent for our entire community. If we allow one person to ignore our rules with impunity, what message does that send to everyone else? The slide showed before and after photos of other neighborhoods, allegedly showing what happens when HOA standards aren't enforced. An older woman I didn't recognize raised her hand tentatively. Karen, what exactly did he do that's so terrible? Most of these things seem pretty minor. Karen's smile was triumphant, like she'd been waiting for exactly this question. Besides the obvious landscaping violations that he's refused to correct, Mr. Mitchell has been observed engaging in surveillance of neighbors' properties. She's been seen taking notes while walking through our community, asking inappropriate questions about HOA finances, and displaying behavior that makes residents feel uncomfortable and unsafe in their own neighborhood. She clicked to another slide showing a grainy photograph of me walking down the street with a small notebook. This kind of suspicious behavior, combined with his aggressive refusal to follow simple community guidelines, creates an atmosphere of tension and fear that affects everyone's quality of life. The way Karen described my daily walks and grocery lists made me sound like some kind of neighborhood spy or potential terrorist. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Karen, that's completely false. I've never taken notes on anyone's property. And asking about HOA finances is every resident's legal right. But the damage was already done. I could see it in my neighbors' faces. Doubt, suspicion, the uncomfortable shifting in seats that happens when people start believing lies about someone they thought they knew. Furthermore, Karen continued, ignoring my protest, as Mr. Mitchell has been uncooperative with HOA maintenance staff and has made veiled threats about legal action against community leadership. This was getting more ridiculous by the minute. The only maintenance staff I'd seen was her husband destroying my rosebush, and the only legal threats had come from her fake lawyer. Mrs. Johnson from 3 houses down raised her hand. Has he actually threatened anyone directly? Karen's expression grew grave, like she was about to reveal state secrets. While no direct physical threats have been made, his pattern of behavior and documented violations suggest an escalating disregard for community welfare that could potentially lead to more serious problems. By the time I left that meeting, I felt more isolated than I had since Linda's funeral. Karen had successfully painted me as the community troublemaker, a suspicious character who watched neighbors and threatened the safety of Meadowbrook Gardens. The worst part was seeing how many people believed her, or at least were willing to go along with her narrative rather than risk becoming her next target. The fourth attack was personal, cruel, and crossed every line of human decency that should exist between neighbors. I woke up on a Thursday morning to find my rosebush, Linda's memorial, the one thing that brought me comfort in my grief, had been butchered in the night. The beautiful plant that had been thriving just hours before was now cut down to a pathetic 2-inch stub. Next to the destroyed memorial was a bill for $500, itemized and official looking, charged to my account for emergency landscape remediation services. The invoice was signed by Meadowbrook Gardens Maintenance and included detailed line items. After hours emergency response, $200, hazardous material removal, $150. I called Karen immediately, my hands shaking with a combination of rage and grief that I hadn't felt since watching Linda take her last breath. Karen, someone destroyed my wife's memorial rose bush and left me a $500 bill for the privilege. My voice was barely controlled, each word carefully measured to avoid saying something I might regret. Her response was sickeningly cheerful, like she was discussing the weather or her weekend plans. "Oh yes, Mr. Mitchell, your deceased plant was creating a public health hazard, so we had it professionally removed by certified landscaping specialists. The bill covers emergency after-hours service, hazardous material handling, and proper disposal according to municipal guidelines." The casual way she said deceased plant while talking about Linda's memorial made me want to throw my phone through the window. Deceased plant, Karen. That rose bush was perfectly healthy yesterday. It was blooming. It was beautiful. It was the only thing I had left of my wife. My voice cracked on the last words, and I hated that this woman was hearing me break down. Who authorized this destruction? Who gave you permission to come onto my property in the middle of the night and destroy my personal belongings? I demanded, though part of me already knew the answer. Karen's tone shifted to that familiar icy authority, the voice of someone who had never been successfully challenged. "Joy, President, I have emergency powers to address immediate health and safety violations that pose risks to community welfare. Your rotting plant was attracting insects, creating unpleasant odors, and generating multiple neighbor complaints about unsanitary conditions. It was a lie, and we both knew it perfectly well. My rose bush had been perfectly healthy, vibrant, and beautiful. The only neighbor who ever mentioned it was Mr. Rodriguez, who complimented its beauty every time he walked past my garden. I want to see these complaints, Karen. I want names, dates, and documentation of every single complaint you claim to have received. The information is confidential under HOA privacy policies, Mr. Mitchell. However, I can assure you that proper procedures were followed and all actions were taken in accordance with community guidelines." She was hiding behind bureaucratic language, the way guilty people always do when they're caught in lies. Fortunately, I had made one of the smartest decisions of my life just 2 weeks earlier, installing a simple security camera system to monitor my property. The cameras were basic, nothing fancy, just enough to keep an eye on my garden and front door. When I reviewed the footage from the night my rose bush was destroyed, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The person who cut down Linda's memorial wasn't some professional landscaping crew working under emergency authorization. It was Jim Matthews, Karen's own husband, sneaking into my yard at 2:15 in the morning with a pair of hedge clippers and a small flashlight. But here's what really blew my mind. He had a key to my side gate. I watched the footage 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from grief and anger. Jim clearly inserted a key into my gate lock, opened it like he owned the place, and walked directly to the rose bush like he knew exactly where it was located. He methodically cut it down to nothing, even brought a small trash bag to collect the pieces, then locked my gate behind him like nothing had happened. This wasn't random vandalism or emergency maintenance. This was a planned operation executed with military precision in the dead of night. But how did Karen's husband get a key to my property? I had never given one to the HOA, never authorized any kind of access, and the previous owner had moved to Florida 3 years ago. The implications were terrifying. If they had a key to my gate, what other keys did they have? How many other neighbors' properties could they access whenever they wanted? How long had this surveillance and harassment been going on? And how many other people were too afraid to speak up about it? The fifth and final attack was the most audacious yet. Karen tried to destroy me legally with threats that would have terrified most people into submission. A certified letter arrived on a Friday afternoon, sent from Peterson Williams and Associates Attorneys at Law, threatening to sue me for a laundry list of charges that read like a legal thriller novel. Harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress upon community members. The letter began. It claimed I had been stalking neighbors, making false accusations against HOA leadership, and creating a hostile living environment that has caused measurable psychological harm to multiple residents of Meadowbrook Gardens. The legal language was deliberately intimidating, full of phrases like cease and desist all harassment activities, monetary damages exceeding $50,000, and criminal charges may be pursued if violations continue. For a moment, reading that letter in my empty kitchen, I felt that familiar wave of helplessness wash over me like a cold tide. Maybe Karen was right. Maybe I should just give up, sell my house, and move somewhere else to start over. Maybe fighting her was just making everything worse, and I was actually hurting my neighbors by continuing this battle. The letter was designed to make me feel exactly that way, defeated, isolated, and ready to surrender. But something about the letter bothered me, a detail that didn't quite fit with the overall intimidation strategy. I decided to do a little research on this prestigious law firm that was supposedly representing the HOA against my reign of neighborhood terror. What I found was both hilarious and revealing. Peterson Williams and Associates didn't exist anywhere except in Karen's imagination. The address listed was a strip mall 20 meters away in a building that housed a dry cleaner, a nail salon, and a vacant storefront with newspaper taped over the windows. The phone number went to a generic voicemail system that sounded like it cost $5 to set up. But the most interesting discovery was the return address label itself. It had been printed on the same type of laser printer that Karen used for all her HOA correspondence, the same slightly faded toner that made all the letters look gray instead of black, the same barely noticeable streak down the right side of the page that indicated a dirty printer drum. That's when something clicked in my brain, a memory from 15 years ago that I had completely forgotten until this moment. I went down to my basement and dug through boxes of old work files, searching for something I wasn't even sure I still had. Finally, buried under tax returns and insurance papers, I found what I was looking for, the original blueprints for Meadowbrook Gardens. I had been part of the city planning team that approved this development back in 2008, fresh out of college, and eager to make my mark on urban design. Sarah Wilson and I had worked together on the environmental impact studies, drainage plans, and municipal compliance reviews. As I spread the yellowed blueprints across my dining room table, one detail jumped out at me like a neon sign. The vacant lot next to my house, the one Karen claimed the HOA was managing temporarily while waiting for auction approval, was clearly marked on the original city plans as permanent public green space. It was never supposed to be sold to anyone ever under any circumstances. The lot was designated as a community buffer zone, meant to provide natural drainage during heavy rains and maintain sight lines for emergency vehicles. There were easements, environmental protections, and municipal ordinances that specifically prevented this land from ever being developed or sold to private parties. Karen had been lying about the auction, but more than that. She had been illegally collecting management fees from the community for maintaining what was actually city property. Every month for 3 years, residents had been paying extra HOA dues to cover vacant lot maintenance. That was never her responsibility in the first place. I realized I had stumbled onto something much bigger than HOA harassment and power games. This was fraud, embezzlement, and possibly even criminal misappropriation of public funds. But I also realized something else that made my heart race with anticipation. As one of the original engineers who designed this community, I might have legal options that Karen never saw coming. City ordinances that I had helped write 15 years ago, environmental protections that I had researched and implemented, and municipal codes that I knew better than almost anyone else in the county could be the key to turning this entire situation around. Karen had picked the wrong neighbor to terrorize. The next morning, I called Sarah Wilson, a lawyer who specialized in property rights and municipal law. Sarah and I had maintained our professional relationship over the years, collaborating on several city projects in environmental impact studies. When I explained the situation over coffee at our usual diner downtown, her eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that lawyers get when they smell a winnable case. David, if what you're telling me is true, Karen Matthews has been running an illegal operation for 3 years. But more importantly, you might have priority purchase rights on that public lot under the municipal codes we helped write. She pulled out her tablet and started scrolling through city ordinances with the speed of someone who had memorized half the municipal code. What do you mean by priority purchase rights? I asked, though I was starting to remember the anti-corruption legislation we had drafted after a scandal involving city council members profiting from abandoned properties. Sarah found the relevant statute and turned her tablet toward me. Remember that anti-corruption ordinance you helped draft in 2009? The one designed to prevent public officials from profiting off abandoned city property? I nodded, remembering the late nights we'd spent crafting language to close legal loopholes after a major scandal involving the mayor's brother. While that ordinance includes a provision allowing original project engineers to purchase mismanaged public land at fair market value, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of abuse, she highlighted the relevant section with her finger. The law was designed to give people with expertise and investment in community development the right to step in when public property is being mismanaged. Sarah's research revealed that the vacant lot, being original public space that had been illegally managed by a private entity, could be purchased by qualified individuals for the symbolic price of $1 per square foot, roughly $1,200 total for the entire lot. But the process had to be initiated quickly before Karen could figure out what was happening and try to cover her tracks. If you want to really mess with her world, Sarah said with a grin that reminded me why I'd always liked working with her. We filed the purchase application on a Friday afternoon and scheduled the closing for Monday morning. That way, she won't know what hit her until it's too late to do anything about it. We spent the entire weekend preparing a comprehensive legal package that would hit Karen from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah helped me file the emergency land purchase application, complete with documentation of Karen's illegal management activities and my qualifications as the original design engineer for the community. We also prepared a separate civil lawsuit against the HOA for fraud, harassment, and misappropriation of community funds. So de pesto resistance was a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office about Karen's fake lawyer letter, which constituted practicing law without a license, a felony in our state that carried serious criminal penalties. By Sunday evening, everything was in place like pieces on a chessboard. My land purchase would be finalized Monday morning at 8:30 sharp, and I had arranged with Officer Martinez from the local police department to be available if Karen tried to interfere with my legal rights. What I didn't know was that Karen had her own Monday morning surprise planned for me. I found out when Jim Matthews knocked on my door Sunday night, looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His clothes were wrinkled, his hands were shaking, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected Karen to appear behind him at any moment. "David, I need to tell you something important. Can I come in?" "David, I need to tell you something," Jim said once we were sitting in my living room, his hands shaking as he accepted a cup of coffee. "Karen's planning to have you arrested tomorrow morning. She's been telling people you threatened her, and she's convinced some of the neighbors to sign statements saying you've been acting dangerously. Jim's revelations about Karen completely changed my understanding of her manipulation. He shared that she had been planning my removal since I questioned one of her violation notices and had been secretly spying on my house at night. Karen had built a case against me, turning my daily actions into suspicious behavior. She had been systematically collecting personal information on me and other neighbors, using her position to exploit violations and embezzle funds for her real estate license courses. Worse, she planned to profit from selling the vacant lot by bypassing proper procedures. Jim, who had been coerced into helping her, provided all the evidence needed to expose Karen. Determined to end this, I signed the papers for the lot, marking the beginning of my effort to take control of the situation and put an end to her abuses. After purchasing the land, I stood on my new property, holding the deed, only to see Karen approaching, dressed in her usual authoritative purple blazer. She immediately called the police, claiming I was trespassing on HOA property and threatening to have me arrested for being mentally unstable. As she theatrically addressed the gathered neighbors, I calmly informed her that I was standing on my own land. When the police arrived, Officer Martinez, who recognized me from my previous work, quickly realized the situation wasn't what Karen had portrayed. Officer Martinez calmly intervened after Karen's accusations, reviewing the property deed I handed him. He confirmed that I was the legal owner of the land, not Karen, and the lot had always been public property. Karen, stunned, tried to present her own documents claiming authority over the lot, but they were invalid. As the neighbors began to realize the truth, Mr. Rodriguez questioned Karen's claims, and Sarah Wilson, appearing with a briefcase full of legal documents, prepared to take the next step in exposing Karen's deceit. Sarah took control of the situation, revealing to the community the full extent of Karen's illegal actions, including managing public property without authority, collecting unauthorized fees, and using her position to harass residents. Despite Karen's desperate attempt to deflect blame and accuse Sarah, and the gathering moved to the community center, where Sarah presented solid evidence against Karen, including financial records, illegal property management schemes, and even security footage showing Karen's involvement in property destruction. As Sarah methodically laid out the proof, the neighbors went from disbelief to outrage, realizing they had been manipulated by someone they trusted, Karen's personal expenses. As the truth about Karen's betrayal unfolded, the room erupted in outrage, with residents demanding answers about stolen money and illegal surveillance. Karen, trying to salvage her reputation, made a last-ditch attempt to justify her actions, but her words fell flat. Jim Matthews, her husband, then stood up, confirming her wrongdoing and announcing his decision to divorce her. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote to remove Karen from her position as HOA president and demand restitution. Within 2 weeks of Karen's actions being exposed, she faced criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and practicing law without a license. The district attorney treated it as a public corruption case, and the local newspaper made Karen infamous. She lost her real estate job, was rejected for a new license, and was forced to sell her house to cover legal fee. The court ordered her to repay over $60,000 in illegally collected fees, and several other HOA presidents resigned in shame. I was elected as the new HOA president, focusing on transparency, simplicity, and treating neighbors with respect. I reduced the governing documents and turned the vacant lot into a community garden, dedicating it to Linda Mitchell, whose rosebush I replanted in her memory, symbolizing our community's transformation into a place of peace and cooperation. 6 months after the conflict with Karen Matthews, Meadowbrook Gardens had transformed into a thriving, united community where neighbors knew each other's names and cared for each other's well-being. Children played freely without fear, gardens flourished, and the community center became a place for family gatherings. Our story of standing up to Karen's oppressive HOA rules sparked citywide reforms, including HOA oversight training for police. Karen learned the hard way that unchecked power destroys itself. While the neighbors realized they didn't have to tolerate abuse, I learned that standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult, can bring about extraordinary change and honor those who believe in justice.